Yep, good.
Hello, welcome to Deeper in the Dogma. Tonight we are going to be going over the Book of Daniel with FloydFP. A few months ago, I believe it was 2 or 3 months ago, we had FloydFP on with Peripheral Prophet talking about biblical prophecies. Were they actually fulfilled? Things along that line. One of the books that was discussed quite often within that podcast there was about with the Book of Daniel, which most Christians will consider a prophetic book of some sort. It's actually in the collection of what they call like the prophets there. Well, traditionally in most Jewish cultures in the Talmud, it's not considered prophetical at all. So tonight, Floyd is kind of going to dive into the Book of Daniel here and take a look at these prophecies and see whether or not they actually were prophecies and whether they actually were fulfilled. Um, this is just a critique from Floyd's point of view. So if you agree with him, or if you but haven't really done a lot of textual critiques of the Bible, this would be kind of a good resource for you to have. If you are an apologist looking at common objections that people put out to certain biblical prophecies, well, I mean, this is going to be an entire episode full of people critiquing these so-called prophecies. So either way, tune in. If you have comments, I have the live chat going tonight. Feel free to throw in anything there. If this is a topic that interests you, feel free to message myself on Sock account or Deep in the Dogma to jump in, and I will send you a link to come in. So that being said, tonight on the panel, as we're discussing this, we have Floyd FP, obviously, Hell in a Handbasket, Positively Godless, or sorry, I can't remember what you go by when you're outside of the
It's Scott. Scott's
Scott,
fine.
Scott,
Right.
and myself. So, Floyd, feel free to take it away.
All right, thanks, Sokka. Okay, let me start out with the common claim that's made about the Book of Daniel. What if I told you guys that in this book that was written hundreds of years before the event actually happened, that this book predicts that the Messiah would be killed, and not only that he would be killed, but it actually gives the specific date, the specific year on when he would be killed. If that's the case, would you find that to be very convincing? If that was actually the case, you have a book written hundreds of years before the event happens that predicts the Messiah would be killed, and it actually gives the year of when it would happen. So let me throw out that to you guys. Do you think would that be convincing to you? Do you think something special is going on, or perhaps supernatural, or just a remarkable prediction that came true? Would you guys find that convincing?
I mean, providing that it was in a form that clearly relates to the story that it did prophesize, as long as it's not any Nostradamus, the two lions attack the tower. Oh, look at that! It's World War II, and nothing too vague like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's always the case. Some of these prophecies are very vague. They use very vague terms. It could mean certain things. You can interpret in some way. But if you actually have a verse that says the Messiah will be cut off and actually gives dates around it, I mean, when you consider that a stronger claim, a stronger, more clearer prophecy?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Yeah. So keep that in mind, and I'm going to present the case for that, and then I'm going to see if you kind of find that convincing, and then I'll kind of give more detail about it a little later, and I'll kind of uh, make it a little bit more understandable. So I'll start my presentation now. I'm going to give some background on the context of the Book of Daniel. Can you see that? Can you see my PowerPoint?
I can.
All right, great. I'm just going to start with a quick overview of ancient Jewish history, starting around 1000 BCE. Around that time, there were basically two kingdoms. There were there are a bunch of tribes, considered 12 tribes, some in the north, some in the south. The northern kingdom was called Israel. So there were two kingdoms. The northern kingdom was Israel, and the southern kingdom was Judah. And around 1050, they united under Saul, under David, under Solomon, and that lasted to around 930 or 922. It depends which scholar dating you go by, Albright or Galil. Some scholars even question how strong the United Kingdom was. Some kind of think the Davidic kingdom of Judah really didn't have that strong of an influence over the northern kingdom that the Bible suggests. But anyway, there was supposedly a United Kingdom of Israel and Judah that lasted around 930 to 922. Around that time, Solomon dies, and they basically don't like his son. They don't like his son, all the taxes they had to pay him, so forth. So they split up again. So they split up, and the northern kingdom of Israel lasted to around 720 BCE. The last capital of it was Samaria, and it was conquered by the Assyrian Empire. And then the southern kingdom of Judah lasted to 586 BCE, and the last capital of Judah was Jerusalem, and that was conquered by the Babylonian Empire. During that time, the Babylonians basically defeated Assyria, and King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, he basically took over the area, and Jerusalem became the subjects of Babylon. That happened around 605 BCE. And then in 597, Jerusalem was besieged by Nebuchadnezzar, 597 BCE. And then at that time, he removed the Jewish king. That was Yehoiakim. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Yehoiakim, and he replaced him basically with his own king, with a puppet king, Jekiah, to govern Judea. And then later, Jekiah rebels against him, so Nebuchadnezzar has enough. He goes in, destroys the city, destroys the temple, and that happened in 586 BCE, and he deports a large amount of the population of Judah to Babylon. Basically, the more higher class people got exiled to Babylon. So that's what's called the Babylonian exile of the Jewish people. That started at 586 BCE, and at that time, the book of Jeremiah was written around those events. So the prophet Jeremiah lived at those times, and his book basically was written around the events of that time. And that's the background for the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is an Old Testament text, and it records the activities and visions of Daniel, who was a noble Jew taken into Babylonian captivity as a teenager in 605 BCE, and he becomes an advisor for the royal court of the Babylonians. There's in the Protestant canon, there's 12 chapters in the book of Daniel. Chapters 1 through 6 are Aramaic folk tales that give incidents of how certain people who kept their faith were saved by God during the Babylonian exile. In one of these chapters, we have the famous story of Daniel in the lion's den. I think most people are kind of at least heard that story, where Daniel's in the lion's den, and because of his faith, God saves him. It's a very it's a very popular story in the Bible. And then chapters 7 through 12, that's what I'm basically going to focus on, is 7 through 12. That's Hebrew revelations that gives the history of the rising powers of Babylon, Medes and Persians, Greece, and gives a very accurate description of the history of the 2nd century BCE, and describes very well the actions of Antiochus Epiphanes. That was in the 2nd century BCE. Then gives actual predictions about the downfall of Antiochus and Israel's triumph, which are generally inaccurate according to history. Okay, so here is the prophecy that's given that I talked about at the very beginning of the show. It's somewhat complicated, but I'm going to walk you through it, and if you're confused, you don't understand anything, please step in and ask any questions. I don't want this to be just a monologue. If you're confused or you don't understand something, or you want me to give more background about the Jewish history, please ask questions, because some of this is complicated, and some of it, to really understand it, requires some background information. That's why I gave some background information of the history of Israel and Judah. So here I'm going to read you the prophecy. This is from the North American Standard Bible. It's considered to be a very literal translation of the Bible. It says, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah the Prince, there will be 70 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, and even in times of distress. Then, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the Prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. But in the midst of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abomination will come one who makes desolate, even until complete destruction. One that is decreed and is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So the kind of the key verse there is what I put in bold. Then after 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the Prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So here you actually have a verse that says the Messiah will be cut off. In other words, will be killed. So what is the 70 weeks, and what's actually going on here? There is not totally clear if you don't understand the context around it. So what do we mean by week here? Well, week is interpreted as weeks of years. So in this context here, 1 week equals 7 years. So in verse 25, when it says, so you are to know and discern from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. That's the starting point of this prophecy. Until the Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks. So 7 times 7 is 49 years, and 62 weeks, which is 434 years. And it will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Okay, then in verse 26 we read, then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off. So what does 62 weeks mean in this context? Well, you have the 7 weeks of years, plus you have the 62 weeks of years. That adds up to 483 years. Okay, you with me so far on this?
Sorry, I missed the part where you said that. So why is a week being interpreted as weeks of years?
Well, if you look at if you start with the starting of the chapter, Daniel looks at the book of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah predicts that the Babylonian exile will last 70 years, and after 70 years, the Babylonian exile will end. Well, the problem with Daniel is the persecutions are continuing. So he says, well, what's up with this prophecy of 70 years? And he laments that the Jewish people are sinful and so forth. So he gets a sign from the angel Gabriel, and the angel Gabriel makes it clear, saying, no, it's not 70 years. It's really 70 weeks of years. So, in other words, 7 times 70, which is 490 years. So Gabriel's making him understand that it was really 70 times 7, which is 490. So when it says weeks, it's actually weeks, years. And I'm going to describe that a little bit more in detail a little later. But no interpreter disputes that. When it says weeks, it's really weeks of years. And I'll show more of the context of it a little later. So you have the 7 weeks, which is 490 years. You have the 62 weeks, which is 434. That adds up to 483. Okay, so you want to take the time when the word went out, when it was decreed that Jerusalem would be rebuilt, and you're going to add 483 years to that. So when did that word go out? Well, there was a decree by Artaxerxes. Hopefully I'm saying that right, Artaxerxes. That was issued on 444 BCE. So that's the starting point. That's when the word went out, so to speak, to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. So you start at 444 BCE, and we're going to add 400 prophetic years. What a prophetic year is, it's an average of the months, which is 30 months in a 30 days in a month. That comes to 360 days. That's 476 solar years. The way you get that is you take 360, you multiply that by 43, that's how many years you have. You divide that by 365, which is the amount of days in a solar year. You get 476 solar years. So 444 BCE, you add 476 solar years. That comes to right around 32 to 33 CE. And that is the estimated time for Jesus' crucifixion, which is around 30 to 33 CE. So here you have a book written hundreds of years before the events happened, predicting that the Messiah would be killed right around 33 CE. How about that?
So there you have it.
So you find that convincing?
No, absolutely. Unless you have some more details that you're leaving out here. Well, I mean, I think one of the things, and I think that Still Smiling Skeptic brought it up nicely in the chat as well, is when you start off with it's weeks of years or weeks of weeks, or so when you have to start inventing new ways to break down time, it starts to get a little less convincing at that point in time.
Yeah, well, I mean, this came from, the angel Gabriel, but even if you just say, well, okay, well, I don't believe in angels, it's still written before the Gospels, right? It's still written before any book in the New Testament, right? It's because this book is actually in the Old Testament, right? So this book, regardless of when you think it was, what the specific date it was written in, it was still written before Jesus's time, yet it offers a date about the future, right? And if these calculations are right, it predicts Jesus would be, or the Messiah, I should say. It doesn't actually mention, the name Jesus, but it says the Messiah will be killed, will be cut off, is the words it use, around 32, 33 CE, assuming these calculations are correct, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, that's what some Christians claim is going on here. Now, the New Testament itself, there's nothing in the New Testament that says that this prophecy, this is known as the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel 9. Nowhere in the New Testament does it declare that this is a prophecy about Jesus. The Gospels do mention the book of Daniel. They do talk about the abomination that desolates, which is found in this chapter and in these verses that I just mentioned. But nowhere in the New Testament does it actually say the Messiah being cut off here. Yeah, that's a prophecy about Jesus. But many Christians claim that this is about Jesus. Why? Because it says the Messiah will be cut off. Well, who's the Messiah? Well, Jesus, of course. So anyway, that's the claim. So let me give you more background, and if you're hearing this for the first time, you might find this to be very convincing, right?
Well, Kenneth Amis in the comments here asks a question that says, doesn't the choice of how to calculate years, solar, average days in a month, don't count leap years, etc., dilute the potency or accuracy of the prediction?
Yeah. Yes, yeah, absolutely. That's a good observation, and it actually gets a lot worse than that. It gets a lot more complicated than that. So yeah, how what are you considering a year? How do you judge a year? That's a good question, and I'm actually going to go into detail about that. That is a significant problem, and I'm actually going to spend a good amount of time discussing that. So so stay tuned. That is one of the issues. So. All right. I guess if there's no more questions, I can move on.
Yeah.
All right. So this prophecy was introduced to me well over 25 years ago.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
What will be built with a moat?
Well, the city. They build. An ancient city, they build walls up and they put a moat around it. For protection.
Oh yeah, I know what a moat is.
Yeah.
So it says that will be built with a moat.
Yeah, in a plaza.
By the time of the decree, or
no,
7 weeks.
They'll say, okay, we're going to start building it now, and during these 434 years, that's when the building takes place. It takes place over many years.
And it'll continue to be built even through wars and what have you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So a city isn't built overnight. It's going to take a long time.
Okay.
So, all right, I'll move on unless there's no more questions. All right, let me go in a little bit more detail about the book of Daniel. Like I mentioned before, it was written in the background of the Babylonian exile. Daniel's claimed to be a Jew during the Babylonian exile that actually was an advisor on the Babylonian court. The genre of Daniel is an apocalyptic writing. And what an apocalyptic writing is this form of writing is to address the great suffering that people are facing and to assure them that will soon come to an end and their enemies will be destroyed. It encourages the people to remain faithful since God will soon intervene. So that's what an apocalyptic writing means. It's a subset of a prophetic writing of prophecy, where it's a special kind. It's dealing with with great suffering of the people now, and it's assuring things are going to get better real soon because you're suffering greatly right now. So it's just not some general prophecy that could happen sometime in the future. Some unspecified future, but it's to meet the immediate needs of the people that are suffering, right then and there. It also offers what's called an eschatology. You might hear that term. What eschatology means is it's a revelation concerning the end of the present age. So, in eschatology, Christian eschatology is, Jesus will come, will have a second coming, and there'll be a resurrection of the dead, and the Christians will go to heaven, and everyone else goes to hell, and there'll be a new earth, and so forth. So it's a prediction, a revelation about the end of this age, and what will happen, in the future. Basically what will happen in the end of the world as we know it, so to speak. So the book of Daniel actually offers that at the end, chapter 12. Characteristics of an apocalyptic writing. Not these characteristics. Not all these characteristics have to be in apocalyptic writing, but they usually share some of them, and they have them in common. One is that the present age is ruled by evil powers. So, things are real bad right now, and it seems like, the devil's in power, or great evil forces are in power that's causing great evil in the world. The age to come will be ruled by God. So a new age will come, it will be ruled by God. The end of the present age will happen in the very near future, and the transition will occur very quickly. So it'll be a very dramatic switch over. The transition will include wars, plagues, famine, earthquakes, and other natural disasters. So, it's not going to be just a nice, quiet transition. It's going to be a pretty dramatic, transition, with many, big signs going on. A general resurrection of the dead will take place. So again, we're at the end of the age, so forth, and there will be a resurrection. There'll be a final judgment, and also the supporters of evil will be annihilated, and God's supporters will enter a period of peace and happiness. So those are common characteristics of apocalyptic writing. Other examples of apocalyptic writings. There are sections in the Old Testament which fit the criteria. They can be found in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and Micah. Non-canonical Old Testament text is the Book of Enoch and the War Scrolls of the Dead Sea. The War Scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls is an example. In the New Testament, examples are the Book of Revelation. That's a very good example of apocalyptic writing, is Revelation. And also in the Gospels, we have the little apocalypse in Matthew 24, 25. And also in the Pauline and pastoral epistles, we have apocalyptic themes. In non-canonical Christian texts, we have the ascension of Isaiah, the apocalypse of Peter, the apocalypse of Paul, the apocalypse of Thomas, and the Christian Sabellines. Those are all examples of apocalyptic writings. Okay, let's talk about who actually wrote the book of Daniel. Conservative scholars believe Daniel himself wrote the text. Well, why do they think that? Well, pretty much because the book says so. I'm not going to read you all these verses, but I'll read you a few of them. Like in Daniel 7:1, it says, he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. And Daniel 8:27, it says, then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. So here it says, I, Daniel, in the first person. Daniel 9:2, in the first week of his reign, I, Daniel, observed. So it actually gives specific years of reigns of kings. So from that, we can actually date these periods. Daniel 10:2, in those days, I, Daniel, were mourning for 3 entire weeks, and so forth. I, Daniel. So again, first person.
Well, was that weeks, or is that weeks of weeks?
I think that's meant literal weeks, little weeks right there.
I was just going to ask the exact same thing.
That's actually.
Well, I mean, one of the things that you brought up there at the beginning, conservative scholars believe Daniel himself wrote the text. Is there any conservative scholars out there that hold to a position of that certain books, the writers were anonymous, that they don't know who wrote those? Because it seems like that the idea that when you get into, especially with like the very conservative scholars, that they have to know who wrote the book, that they won't acknowledge that a book could have anonymous source that they don't know who it is.
Yeah, I mean, if it's part, if they're evangelicals or fundamentalists, they believe, the Bible's the inerrant word of God. If it says, the Bible's, what's the saying? The Bible's, I forget what it is. The Bible says it, and I believe it. I forget, something like that. I'm drawing blank. It's like God said it. The Bible. I forget what it is. But anyway, yeah. But I mean, you will find scholars. There's a certain range. There's very conservative fundamentalist scholars that believe that every bit of the Bible is the inspired word of God, and you should take it literally. And then you have liberal scholars who say, oh no, it's written by men. A lot of it's anonymous, written at a different period. Some of them are forgeries. Some of them claim to be written by so and so, but we know it's not. And then you have a bunch of people in between. And they have to give their reasons. And obviously, I find the critical scholars and the non-conservative scholars, arguments more convincing. And one example is my next point here. The author refers to Daniel in the third person. So if Daniel actually wrote it, well, there are sections where it refers to Daniel in the third person. For example, Daniel 1:6, it says, "Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel," and 1:8, "But Daniel made up his mind, and he would not defile himself." And so it's talking about Daniel in the third person here. Well, did Daniel write that? So there's some question there.
Well, I mean, that's always an interesting point to throw out there, because there's a lot of things that seems to be kind of harmonized with the Bible. A lot of things that people bring up as contradictions or inconsistencies get harmonized pretty easily. I mean, there's apologists have been doing this for hundreds of years, thousands of years. But you come across things like this, especially within these translations, where when they had this stuff and they translated it over to English or whatever channel or whatever, language, can't talk tonight. The editing of it is terrible. Like, you think that there has to be somebody that has to go through this and be like, ooh, hold on a second, we switched from third person to first person in the book of Daniel here. We should probably go back and fix that. I mean, why do these things still persist? I mean, it boggles my mind.
Yeah, I mean that's why the Bible can be so interesting, and that's why there's so much scholarship. Think of how many books and many interpretations and commentaries and debates and so forth have been going on with the Bible. It's because it's not clear. There's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of vague things. Yeah, even among Jewish scholars, they don't agree with each other on interpretations of when certain things were written and what do certain things mean. And there's a lot of unknowns, and there's a lot of evidence of redaction, of rewritings, and so forth. So, yeah, again, the Bible has been, written and put together and copied and so forth over hundreds of years. So during that time, yeah, there's going to be a lot of changes, a lot of evolution of the text. So it's us, modern day scholars have to try to sort all this out. So that's why there's all these issues, and that's why I'm here today talking about just one of the issues of the Bible. There's many of them, and I'm just dealing with one of the issues. So yeah, it's not simple at all. In the New Testament, Jesus actually references the book of Daniel. So this is one reason why conservative Christian scholars believe so, because Jesus says so. In Matthew 24:15-16, it says, Jesus says, "So when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." And yeah, this is part of the little apocalypse, Matthew 24. It's taken from Mark 13:14, who doesn't mention Daniel but Matthew adds spoken by the prophet Daniel. And again, and it mentions that this desolating sacrilege right in the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel 9, which we're looking at now. Matthew also uses similar language that's found in the book of Daniel. Matthew's obviously used and it was influenced by the book of Daniel. For example, in Daniel 13 it says, "I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancients of Days and was presented before him." And then compare that to Matthew 24:30. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heavens, and then all the tribes of earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heavens with power and great glory. So, very, very similar terminology there. Okay, so what do non-conservative scholars believe? Well, they believe that it was written during the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, right in the 2nd century BCE. The result of this persecution that was going on at the time was the Maccabean revolt that led to Israel's brief independence. Daniel 7 through 12 deals with this time period. They basically believe that Daniel is a fictional character, and the book has anonymous writers. So I'm going to give reasons why they think that, despite the book presenting itself as written by a character who says that he lived during the time of the Babylonian exile during the 6th century BCE. So let's look at the languages used in the book of Daniel. It's not written in all one language, which is quite interesting. In Daniel chapter 1 through chapter 2 4a, it's written in Hebrew, and then from 2:4b to through chapter 7, it's written in Aramaic, and then in chapter 8 through 12, it switches back to Hebrew. And then actually outside the Protestant canon, in non-Protestant canons, there's actually more additions within the book of Daniel. There's the prayer of Azarah and the song of the three holy children. It's added into Daniel 3. And there's actually 2 more chapters added to the end of Daniel. The history of Susanna and the history of the destruction of Bel and the dragon. That is written in Greek, and you'll actually find that in the Greek Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament that was written around that time. So here you have a book, written in 3 different languages. Very interesting. Would that come from one author? Dating.
Just to go back to that point, are you saying that? So when was the first version of Daniel found that actually contained Daniel 1 through 14, all completed together?
Well, the oldest copies we have it is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, around that same time we also have the Greek Septuagint. The Masoretic texts, which modern Bibles use, those transcripts, those manuscripts, are basically from around 1000 CE. Although they were taken from previous manuscripts and so forth. But the earliest manuscripts is basically the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Greek Septuagint, and of course the Greek Septuagint is all Greek. It is all Greek, but we have no Hebrew or Aramaic versions of the prayer of Azarah and the history of Susanna and the history of the destruction of Bel and the dragon. So that clearly seems to be written later. And again, they do not even appear in the Protestant canon. If you open up your Protestant Bible there's just chapters 1 through 12. You won't find chapters 13 or 14 in it. But look in a look in a Catholic Bible, and you're most likely will find it, or like a Greek Orthodox or European Orthodox Bible, and also other ancient manuscripts. So I mean, this is evidence that things were added, right? Things were added along the way. Do we have the original copy of Daniel with this evidence? I think it's clear that we don't. That at least someone added chapters 13 and 14 later on. Okay. So when was this book written? When do we think it was written? Well, conservative scholars claim it was written the 6th century BCE. Why? Because basically the text infers so. It says Daniel wrote it. He wrote these stuff down. He says, "I, Daniel." He gives the time period in which he lived. That would be the 6th century BCE. But most Old Testament scholars believe it was actually written during the Maccabean revolt against Greek occupying forces around 168 to 164 BCE. So conservative scholars think it was written in the 6th century, where the majority of Old Testament scholars believe it was actually written in the 2nd century. And the first major critic that we know of that criticized its genuineness was a Greek philosopher, Porphyry of Tyre. He was a Greek philosopher of the 3rd century CE who claimed that the book of Daniel had been written by a person living in the 2nd century BCE during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. So we can go back as early as the 3rd century CE of a critic saying, "Hey, wait a minute here. I don't think this book was written in the 6th century BC. I think it was actually written in the 2nd century," and that's what most Old Testament scholars actually believe today.
When you say most, are you talking? Are we not counting the conservative scholars?
Well, you take the sum of all Bible scholars, conservative and non-conservative. If you take a vote, you'll find that a majority of them believe it was written in the 2nd century. I have points right here. For example, in the New Orthodox Anointed Bible, it notes that the author of Daniel was a pious Jew living under the persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes, 167 to 164 BC. The New Jerusalem Bible states that the book was written during the persecution of the Jews by the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes, 167 to 164 BC. His attempts to seduce the Jews from the observance of the law form the background of his message. So here you have two, very popular study Bibles stating that it was written in the 2nd century BCE. John Collins' commentary of Daniel states that the Aramaic in Daniel is a later form than that used in the Sumerian correspondence, but slightly earlier than the form used in the Dead Sea Scrolls, meaning that the Aramaic chapters 2 through 6 may have been written earlier in the Hellenistic period than the rest of the book, with the visions in chapter 7 being the only Aramaic portion dating to the time of Antiochus. So he's saying those earlier Aramaic folk tales could be older.
One of the things that you brought up earlier when you described Daniel as apocalyptic writing,
right?
Isn't it one of the things that we recognize from apocalyptic writing is that it's written in this sense to feel like it's to talk about current events, but written in a form to feel like it was written much earlier as well.
Right.
That's a characteristic of what we recognize as apocalyptic writing in other places within the Bible as well.
Right. Yeah. So the idea is, some prophet, received a vision, sometime in the past, saying, "Oh well, these hard times were prophesized, but don't worry, God's going to soon intervene and make everything right. So just hang in there, have faith. Everything's going to be made right, and you'll feel a lot better if it was actually prophesized in the past." Saying, "Oh, don't worry, we knew this was coming. So just hang in there, stick with it." It has more weight, has more cloud if you actually think it was written beforehand. John Collins goes on and says the Hebrew portion is, for all intents and purposes, identical to that found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, suggesting a second century BC date for the Hebrew in chapters 1 and 8 through 12. So the analysis of the language suggests that was written in 2nd century, with the Aramaic portions being somewhat earlier. Other reasons why they believe it was written in 2nd century BC. You actually brought this up, Saka, at the very initial beginning. In the Hebrew Bible, Daniel is not included among the prophets. It's in the writings, not in the prophets. This exclusion indicates that both the book and its author were unknown as recently as the 2nd century, when the prophetic canon was fixed. In fact, there is no reference to Daniel before the 2nd century BCE. The theology is too advanced for the 6th century BCE. Chapter 12 discusses the dead being judged and taken into either heaven and hell. That concept of heaven and hell was introduced later by the Greeks, and really wasn't part of 6th century theology. This is a very important point. The historical accuracy is strongest around the events of 160 BCE, and then becomes inaccurate. So what we see is, starting at chapter 1, it gives history of the past around the 6th century, and it's somewhat inaccurate. There's noted inaccuracies with it. As it moves on in the book, in chapter 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and so forth, it gets more and more accurate and gives more and more detail around the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, up to 164. And then, right after 164, it actually gives predictions, which end up being inaccurate. So that is the cutoff date. That's the date the critical scholars give of when it was written. So it starts out somewhat inaccurate, and it gets more and more accurate, and then it falls off. So at that point, that's when they actually think it was written.
Is this something that's typical to ancient literature to let scholars know? Like, is there a methodology that they use to determine the accuracy of something? So let's say if there's something from Socrates or Plato or whoever, and they're talking about something that happened during that time period, and then there's another manuscript or something that describes an event, gives a time period, and it's way fucking off. Is that what they use to determine its veracity?
Yeah, so if you have a book and it's talking about things that are very specific around a certain period and it's very accurate, well, that's a good indication that that's the time it was written. If you have inaccurate information during other times, but you have accurate information at a specific time, that is a key to tell you when it was actually written. So that's a major factor in dating Daniel. Daniel 11:31 refers to the abominable thing that causes desolation. That's the thing I mentioned in the book of Matthew that Jesus talks about, and we'll see that again. This appears to refer to the erection of the statue of Zeus in the Jerusalem temple at 167 BCE. So that would indicate that the book was written later than that date. So it knows about all these things that's going on at that time. So for him to write about them, well, it would have to be written past that time. Other reasons. You want to mention Saka? Or?
I think Saka had to go AFK for a minute.
No.
Okay.
I'm here. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah. Okay. About 180 BCE, Yeshua ben Sira lists the heroes of the Jewish faith, including Enoch, Noah, and Abraham, through to Nehemiah, and Daniel is not mentioned. So here at 180 BCE, Daniel isn't mentioned among the great heroes. You would think if Daniel was written in the 6th century and did all these remarkable things, hey, was a great man of faith, he would be included as one of those heroes, but he's not.
Okay, can I stop you right there?
Yeah.
This is kind of one of the points where I feel Seamus is somewhere scratching the skin off of his neck, hollering at the computer monitor, going, "Argument from silence." You know, would that be a case here with that?
Yeah. I mean, you can suggest that, but it's a cumulative case. And, I'm just not leaning on that. I'm offering one point after another, and all this evidence points to a later date. Yeah, if you just isolated one of these points in itself, yeah, you can make those claims. Oh, argument for 7. That's because he's not listed. Maybe the guy just forgot Daniel, for example. Maybe he was writing down and oops, I forgot Daniel. Oh, bummer. Or I didn't even think about him.
One of the things that has come up, because whether or not Daniel was an actual prophet or not has come up in some discussions in some Jewish message boards as well. That I was kind of reading before this, and one of the things that they pointed out is that within the Jewish faith, they make mention to 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses, whatever. And within them, Daniel isn't mentioned. And in fact, one of the things that they make mention of is that there is a passage within Daniel where, in one of the verses where Daniel refers himself in the first person, that Daniel alone saw the vision, and he was actually standing with 3 people that were recognized as prophets that didn't see it. So the idea is like, is him having a vision or like this revelation? Is that what qualifies as making somebody a prophet, or is this just maybe something that was just revealed to him, or whatever? But the idea is that within the Jewish tradition, Daniel is generally not considered one of the prophets of the religion.
In regards to history, ask yourself, well, if Daniel was written in the 6th century BCE, what would we find? What would we think that would happen? What would be in the if it actually was written at that earlier date, what would be things that would come about from that? People mentioning Daniel, Jews considering him a prophet, him being mentioned earlier, and so forth. And we simply don't find that. Now, again, it could be an argument from silence, but history is not interested in what's possible. History is interested in what is probable. So, again, we're not finding any of the things we should find if Daniel was in fact written in the 6th century. Another point: it contains Greek loanwords. That means these are Greek words that are found in the Aramaic and Hebrew, yet the Greek occupation of the area did not occur until the 4th century BCE. One of the musical instruments in Daniel 3:5 and in subsequent chapters did not exist until the 2nd century BCE. So, imagine I write a story about, in the 1920s, and I mention one of the guys having a cell phone, for example. Whoops, it's not that extreme, but again, it's a clue. The earliest indisputed reference to the book of Daniel occurs in the book of 1 Maccabees, chapter 260. It's dated to approximately 100 BCE. And then the earliest known manuscript copy of a fragment of Daniel was from Qumran. That's the Dead Sea Scrolls. That is also dated approximately 125 to 100 BC. Now, is this deductive proof that it was written at the 2nd century? No, but these are all indicators that it was, that it was written later. It's a cumulative case. if it was written earlier, we would think we would find evidence of it, but because of all these issues, we don't find that. I'm gonna offer more clues a little later. All right, let's get back to this second, 70 weeks prophecies. I'm gonna actually dive deeper into it to make sense of this, because yeah, it is kind of confusing, it's kind of vague. I'm going to start with back in the chapter. This is what I talked about earlier in verse 2. It says, in the year of that's King Darius' reign, so it's giving a specific year here, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years according to the word of the Lord to the prophet Jeremiah. Must be fulfilled for the devastation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So yeah, so you mentioned, well, how do we know weeks is weeks of years? Well, in verse 2 here, it says it refers to the book of Jeremiah. It refers to years, which is 70 years. And notice here where Daniel refers to the book of Jeremiah, refers to him, as a prophet, and regards the book of Jeremiah as scripture. Well, Daniel is supposed to be a contemporary of Jeremiah, right? When Jeremiah was a prophet, his book, if he wrote it or not, would not be considered scripture at the time. Yet Daniel considers the book of Jeremiah scripture. So again, that's another clue that the book of Daniel was written later, since he considers the book of Jeremiah scripture. It wouldn't be considered scripture until later. But here, Jeremiah makes prediction that the Babylonian exile would last for 70 years. But Daniel laments, saying, well, why is persecution still going on? We are sinners, and perhaps that's why. But then the angel Gabriel comes along and says 70 weeks are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint the most holy place. So the whole most holy place obviously is the Jerusalem temple. It'd be fully restored and back in operation. Okay, verse 25. Know therefore, understand, for the time that the word went out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, until the time of an anointed prince, there will be 7 weeks. Now this is a different version. This is a new revised standard version. So the times get split up a little differently here, and this is where the confusion and the different interpretations come to place. And then for 62 weeks it shall be built again, and with streets and moat, but in troubled times. Verse 26. After the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off, and shall have nothing. Instead of the Messiah, it says an anointed one. And the troops of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be a war. Desolations are decreed. He shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he will make sacrifice and offering cease. So what that means is he's going to put an end to the temple sacrifices and offerings. He basically is going to put an end to all the temple worship, and there will be a place. In their place shall be an abomination that desolates, until the decreed end is poured out upon the desolator, which means until this desolator is basically killed, put an end to. Okay, this is still probably confusing you guys, so I'm going to try to break this down even more. And there's a lot of vagueness going on here. Okay, verse 24, 70 weeks. So 70 weeks is considered 70 weeks of years, so that's 490 years are decreed to your people in the holy city to put an end to all this suffering, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, and to anoint the most holy place, to bring the Jerusalem temple back into operation. Okay, verse 25, know therefore and understand, from the time that the word went out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the time of an anointed prince, there shall be 7 weeks. And for 62 weeks it shall be built again with streets and moat, but in troubled times. So again, the key thing here is from the time that the word went out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the time of the anointed prince, there will be 49 weeks. So what happened? What happened after that 49 weeks? Well, who is this anointed prince? Well, critical scholars think there's certain candidates during that time. Jerubbaal, he was the Davidic prince sent by the Persians to govern Judah at the time, or more likely, I thought it was Joshua. He was the first high priest after the exile, so he would have been the anointed one at that time. Or King Cyrus. King Cyrus was the Babylonian king that basically put an end to the exile and let the Jews return to Judah. He was actually in the book of Isaiah. They actually call King Cyrus the Messiah and anointed one. So those three could be candidates. Okay, then it says for 434 years, Jerusalem will be rebuilt. That's those 62 weeks. So it's 62 times 7, which is 434. Just a note. What some Christians will do is say, okay, it says the anointed prince. Well, who's the anointed prince? Well, that's Jesus, right? Well, they'll combine the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks, which is 438, which works out better to the times of Jesus. Again, after 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and have nothing, and the troops of the other prince. They're not talking about Jesus here. We're talking about another guy. He will come in and destroy the city and sanctuary. Its end shall come in with a flood. So basically, this prince, he's going to come in with basically a flood of his army, and basically destroy Jerusalem, and all these desolations are decreed. So again, figuring out this fuzzy math here, it's after 430. It's 434 years, which is 62 weeks, or you can combine the 7 and the 62 weeks, which is 438 years. The anointed one to be killed. So there's two different ways to interpret it. You could just take the 62 weeks, which is 434 years, or take the 7 plus the 62 weeks, and that becomes the 483 years the anointed one will be killed. So here you can see a lot of confusion is already taking place within this, trying to interpret this prophecy. The troops of the other prince who is to come in and shall destroy the city and sanctuary. So we have to identify who's this other prince that's going to come in and destroy the city and sanctuary. Never gives the name, but we have to figure that out. The anointed one. What do they mean in here? The anointed one. Well, the Hebrew is Mashiach or Moshiach. It means an anointed one. That term is given to a king or high priest that's anointed by oil, and it doesn't have to be Jewish. Like for example, in Isaiah 45:1, it declares Cyrus the Great, who's the Babylonian king, as the Messiah. Different versions. Let me go through different versions of how they interpret. King James Version says Messiah will be cut off. The New International Version says the anointed one will be put to death. The English Standard Version says an anointed one shall be cut off. The North American Standard Bible says the Messiah or anointed one will be cut off. Young's literal translation says cut off is Messiah. The Latin Vulgate says Christus in Latin, shall be slain. So Christ shall be slain. Well, who's Christ? Well, you know who Christians think that is. The Greek Septuagint says the anointed one shall be destroyed. So those are a wide range of interpretations there. So they all mention either an anointed one or the anointed one, the Messiah or Christ. So again, it seems to be, if you believe Jesus was Christ and you read these different versions, well, what interpretation are you going to walk away with? Verse 27, abomination that desolates. We're going to see this over and over again. Jesus mentions this phrase. It says, he, in other words, the other prince, shall make strong covenant for many for 1 week. That's the last week of this 490 years. And for half a week he shall make sacrifice and offering cease. That, in other words, he's putting an end to the temple worship. And in their place shall be an abomination that desolates. So he replaces it with something else until the decree end is poured out upon the desolator, until this guy is killed who's causing this problem. Some interpret the he here as Jesus. So when it says he shall make a strong covenant with the many, some will interpret that as Jesus making a strong covenant with many, perhaps with other Christians, I guess. All right, so let me help you break down these 70 weeks again. The angel Gabriel explains that it will take 70 weeks of years for persecution to end and to anoint a most holy place. So it's broken down into 3 sections. 7 weeks, which is 49 years. Then 62 weeks, which is 434 years. That's in verse 26. And then you have 1 week left. 1 week was 7 years, which is divided into 2 periods. So you could interpret these periods as sequential. First it'll be the 49 years, then immediately the 434, and then the 7 years. Or you could have them overlapping, depending how you interpret it. So again, we have a lot of confusion, vagueness going on here. Okay, so let's try to calculate when the anointed one will actually die. How do we actually calculate that? What's the actual math? What's the actual formula to determine when this guy is supposed to die? Well, we take we start from the word when the word went out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, and we add on either 434 years or 483 years, depending on how you interpret that. So you either take the 62 weeks or you do the 7 plus the 62 weeks. So you start at the time when the word went out to restore Jerusalem, rebuild Jerusalem. You add in those years, and that's the year the anointed one is killed. All right, so that's the formula that we want to go to figure out when this anointed one is killed. Okay, so now we have to ask the question: at what date was the word when the word went out to rebuild Jerusalem? Well, I can identify 6 starting dates of these 490 weeks. The first one is Cyrus's decree, and around 538 BCE. I offer the Bible passages here. That's when Cyrus said, go back. You're free. The Babylonian exile is over, and that's when you can go back to Judah and Jerusalem. That's with Daniel reading Jeremiah's prophetic word. So in some interpretations, they don't say decree, they say the word, when the word went out. Not necessarily an official decree. Another time, there was a decree of Darius I at 520 BCE to rebuild Jerusalem. Or you can go with the decree from Antiochus, which is in 458 BCE. This is a very popular date for some Christians to pick. In fact, in our discussion, our first Deeper in Dogma show with Peripheral Prophet, this is the starting date he picked. He picked 458 BCE. But there was another decree from Antiochus, and that was issued in 444 BCE. And on this occasion, a specific authorization went out to rebuild the city walls for Jerusalem. But I don't have to stop there. It could be when it was revealed to Jeremiah.
Well, hold on.
Yeah.
Was Jerusalem fell apart that many times?
No. I mean, it was destroyed in 586. That's when Nebuchadnezzar came in and just trashed the place. He destroyed the temple.
Okay.
He destroyed the temple, and but then the Babylonian exile ended, right?
Right.
So around that, there are different times when we say, okay, go back and rebuild Jerusalem, but there are different decrees to do certain things all along that time in history. For example, in 444 BC, for example,
Okay.
there was a decree just to build the outer city walls. So parts of it was already built, but there was a specific creed at 444 BCE to say, oh yeah, go build the outer walls now.
Okay, and so in the original quote that you read at the beginning from chapter 9, it doesn't does it or does it not say who it is who made the decree or will make the decree?
It does not say. It does not say who.
So now we have to guess.
It just says when the word goes out.
When the word goes out.
Yeah. So when does the word go out? Well, it seems to go out different times.
Okay.
So. And then I have one more. Well, the opening date of Daniel, when the book of Daniel starts, it's in the third year of Boy, I have trouble with these names. I believe it is pronounced Yehoiakim. Yehoiakim. That was in 605 BCE. So that's when supposedly when the book of Daniel starts. So that's when he got the word, when he started writing this thing. So under this view, the 62 weeks of Daniel are probably the period of general pagan domination over the Holy Land. So when was that? That was from 605 to 171 BC. So that would be the 62 weeks. The 70 weeks that Jeremiah is talking about, that was actually a 67-year period of Babylonian dominion over the Holy Land. That was from 605 to 538. The 538 is when the Babylonian exile ended. And the 70 weeks, or 449 years of Daniel, was the time when the Babylonians left Jerusalem in ruins. So that's when. So at 537, at 587, they trashed the place, and then the Babylonian exile ended at 538. And you notice that actually Jeremiah actually predicted 70 years. That unfortunately that doesn't add up to 70 years. It was actually shorter than 70 years. Literalists don't like that, so they'll try to figure out some way to make it 70 literal years. I know I threw out a lot of date there, so I'm probably confusing you guys, and you hopefully your heads aren't spitting.
Well, no, I mean I understand what you're saying, but when you're talking about whether or not Jesus was the Messiah, whether or not Jesus actually fulfilled prophecy, it just seems to make sense to go with the timing that kind of works out with the date of Jesus' crucifixion. Yeah,
Exactly.
Is there anything? I mean. If that's what they're referencing, is there anything really wrong with just saying, okay, well, no, this is the right date because it lines up? Sure, there was these other, potential starting dates, but that obviously can't be it, just because, we have Jesus showing at this date here, so this must have been the one we're talking about. Is that really,
right?
Is that really a weak position?
Well, I mean that's what they're doing, but notice what you're doing there. You're reverse engineering the calculations instead of trying to figure out what Daniel, the author Daniel, means here. You're reverse engineering, saying, okay, well this is talking about Jesus. We need to make this fit. So let's pick the date and the year and the number of years to make it fit. And if that fits, yeah, that's what he meant. That's what he meant. So you're kind of reverse engineering the whole process. Okay. So just to continue, okay, so those are the 6 potential starting dates. Perhaps you could think of some more. I think six is quite enough. Okay, so what do we do about the 434 or the 438 years? Well, you can pick either one of them, but what do we mean by years? And I guess one of the questioners brought this up early on, right? So I'm going to address that right now. Well, when we think of years, right, we mean a solar year, right? And a solar year is 365 and a quarter days. We have to deal with the leap years, right? Well, that's what we normally think a year is, right? 365 days. But is that what the author of Daniel meant? And how did the Jewish writers view a year? Well, they often did not use a solar year. They used a lunar year. And a lunar year is 354 days. So if you take, for example, if you want to figure out how many solar years are in 483 years, you take 43, you multiply that by 354. That gives you a number of lunar days in 483 years. You with me so far? And then if you want to calculate how many solar years, well, you divide that by 365, and that gives you 468 solar years. So if we go with 483 and we say, oh well, it was really lunar years because that's what the Jews used to make the calculation, that equates to 468 solar years. So again, with the Jewish calendar, with the lunar years, it was either 29 or 30 days per month, corresponding to the 29.5-day lunar cycle. So that comes to 354 days a year. But since there's 11 days shorter than a solar year, the Jews would add on a 13th month to the calendar every few years to keep in sync with the solar year. Real simple, right? It's getting really complex. Then comes along Sir Robert Anderson in the 19th century. He worked for Scotland Yard. He invents something called a prophetic year, which is 360 days. It's basically 12 months of 30 days. He basically averages out a month 30 days based on like verses in Genesis and Revelation and so forth. So 438 prophetic years equals 476 solar years. Again, to do the math, you take 360, you multiply it by 483, that gives you the amount of days, and then you divide that by 365, that gives you 476 solar years. And this is the common interpretation among dispensationalists. They'll use this calculation. And again, some interpreters use 434 years, and by placing that first 7 weeks within the 62 weeks. So you have, and then you have a lunar and prophetic years applied to that amount as well. And also you have some assumptions here. You're assuming that the author has accurate historical information and makes no mistakes. You're assuming that this guy actually knew when certain periods were taking place and so forth, and the numbers that he comes up with are accurate. Should we assume that? Looking at the previous chapters, accurate information of the Persian reign was not known to later Jewish writers, and there's actually inaccurate information in it among when he mentions the Median king named Darius. There is no king in history found. So there's issue with, is this actually historically accurate, this information that he has? And also, it assumes that the author meant that this should be taken as literal years. 62 weeks, should that be dead set literal? Should we interpret that as literal 490 years, or it's just a symbolic general number? So there's a lot of assumptions going on here when we're doing these mathematical calculations. And also, on top of that, we have the Julian calendar. If you're calculating this now in our modern times, we go by the Gregorian calendar. But back then it was the Julian calendar, so you have to do a Julian calendar to Gregorian calendar conversion, and a lot of these calculations that they do are overlooked, or simply just makes the calculations more confusing. So you can see all the issues that take place. Some computer geek trivia here. For your Linux or Unix users, if you actually use the cal command, if you type cal 9, 9 is the 9th month, September 1752, if you type this in Linux or Unix, this is the output you get. It goes 1, 2, and 14. And why is this? 11 days are missing. It's not a bug in Unix. This was the actual month in 1752 when England switched from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar. So just a little computer Greek trivia there.
Well, when we adjust for the dates of what would have been interpreted as a year when Daniel supposedly wrote this, how many of those dates now come close to the 30 to 33 AD?
Good question. I'm going to answer that right now.
Awesome. Look at that. I'm on the ball.
All right. So it's time to do our calculations. Okay. So we have all the information we need now, right? Okay. So we have our starting dates, right? And we have our years of what we actually mean by years. So you add all the starting dates to all the years, and here are all the possibilities. Which one do you like? Well, we have 32 CE. If Jesus was crucified around 30 to 33 CE, oh, bingo, that's a good one. 26 CE. That's when the reign of Pilate started. Oh, that's a pretty good one. So let's apply this to Jesus. We assume Jesus dies around 30 CE. So what are some popular calculations that Christian interpreters give? This is the one Peripheral Prophet goes by. He starts with the 457 BCE starting date. He takes it simple. He doesn't deal with all the prophetic years and lunar years and everything. He keeps it simple. 483 solar years. That takes you to 26 CE. That's when Pilate began his reign. Not too bad. Pretty close, right? Some people go with this and say, well, yeah, they declare this is the time when Jesus was baptized. So this is the time when Jesus started his ministry. So that's how some Christians interpret it, that he wasn't actually killed during this time. It just mentions that's when the Messiah comes on the scene. So they'll say, oh, well, he was baptized during this time. This is when his ministry started. The dispensationalists, they go with the calculation I presented at the very beginning of the presentation. They go 444 BCE. They add on their prophetic year, which was a 19th century invention by our Scotland Yard knight, and that takes you right to 3233 CE. Bingo! That sounds like to be a real good one. But notice what I'm doing. I'm reverse engineering, right? I'm starting with the conclusion I want, and picking the year and date that fits it. You can do that with the wide range which I gave.
Is there any contention, just real quick, that cut off and loses all his, what does it say? Cut off and loses all his...
And has nothing.
And has nothing? Is there any contention that means dies? Because that doesn't seem obvious to me.
Yeah. Well, yeah. What does cut off mean? It could mean taken out of power, right, as well?
Yeah, or banished.
Yeah. Yeah, it could. Why not? Yeah.
What does it actually mean according to the scholars?
What's the context?
Who are you asking?
You. I'm asking you.
Well, depending what scholar you ask, you're gonna get different opinions. Most interpreters view that as killed.
Oh, okay.
Are there other places in the Bible where that means killed, where they use that same word? And
no, not exactly.
I mean, that seems very strange. That translation is cut off and loses all his. What was it again?
Cut off and have nothing.
And have nothing.
Yeah, another interpretation is cut off, but not for himself. That's another interpretation we see. Not a very popular interpretation, but that's another one. So not for himself. So he was sacrificed perhaps for someone, for us, for our sins, perhaps. That's one way to view it. But okay. In these more modern literal translations, it says and has nothing. But there's also, you can question, when was Jesus actually killed? Do all church followers agree with him being killed 33? No. Per Irenaeus, it was thought that Jesus was killed at the time of Claudius. He reigned from 41 to 54 CE, and Irenaeus says when he was not yet 50. And per Athanasius, Jesus was killed during the reign of Alexander Jannaeus, around, from 100 BCE to 75 BC. And also, some Christians, to support the historicity of Jesus, they'll say, oh, well, the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud itself mentions Jesus, so that's evidence for the historical Jesus. Well, guess what? The Talmud actually says Jesus was killed at the time of Alexander Jannaeus as well. So is it crystal clear that Jesus was actually crucified around 30 to 33 CE? No, I'm presenting some doubt here. Okay, so if it wasn't Jesus, who was this anointed one that was killed? If it wasn't Jesus, who was the anointed one that was cut off in verse 26? Well, Jewish interpreters, they have certain opinions. Some think it was Alexander Jannaeus, who reigned from 103 to 76 BCE. He was the last of the important Hasmonean leaders. Other Jewish interpreters believe it was Herod Agrippa II, who reigned during the first Jewish-Roman War. And that led to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. So Jewish commentators don't even agree who this anointed one was. And they actually interpret, a lot of people interpret when it says the city was destroyed, they actually interpret that around 70 CE. That's when Jerusalem was destroyed during the first Jewish and Roman War. I'm going to argue against that in a little bit. Many critical scholars, and this is the position I hold, believe it was the high priest Onias III who was killed at 171 BCE. This is the high priest who was killed during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, and this is when all those things that the book of Daniel describes was taking place during that time. During the reign of Antiochus, this was the high priest who was killed. So this is why many critical scholars believe this is the anointed one that Daniel's talking about here. I'm going to give some evidence for that. Pick one. I gave you all those dates. Who's your man? Reverse engine. Pick the time he was killed. Pick the way you pick the way you want to interpret a year. Pick one of the starting dates. See what fits. So again, we're just reverse engineering. Who we want to be this anointed one in verse 26. Again, I mentioned Jews and Christians have made many calculations on all these dates. You can just do a Google 70 weeks prophecy, and you'll find tons of articles on it. I'm going to finish up the book here, chapters 10 through 12. In these chapters, chapter 10 is basically just gives his description of the vision he had. 11 goes into more detail about what's going on. It describes the events leading up to the reign and acts of Antiochus Epiphanes up to 165 BCE. Daniel 11:4 describes the division of the Greek Empire into 4 parts. So after Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire was split into 4 parts by 4 generals. Each general took a part. There's 4 of them. Daniel 11:5 through 20 describes the kingdoms north and south, which is the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic empires. And then again, chapter 11:21 through 35 describes the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. He was the Seleucid king who reigned from 175 to 164 BC. And this is where it gives real good, detailed information of what took place during this time. At verse 11:40, the author actually makes a real prediction. He actually makes a real prediction about the future. He prophesies that a king of the south, which is the Ptolemaic dynasty, will attack the Greeks in Judea under Antiochus. The Greeks will win, and the Greeks will lay spoil to northeast Africa. In fact, Antiochus actually invaded Egypt a number of times to try to take it over. He'll return to Judea and be killed. This actually didn't happen. Antiochus actually fell ill in Persia and died in 164 BCE. He was busy in Persia at the time, looting the treasuries of the Persian temples at this time. So he wasn't in. He didn't get killed in Judea. He was actually in Persia. He was, busy stealing money from them. In chapter 12. At that time when he's killed, the angel Michael, the great captain, he will come down from heaven, and there will be a resurrection of the dead, and the good and evil, good and evil are judged. So there's a general resurrection, and everyone's judged, and that's the end. That's the last week of the 490 years. And Matthew, who's a big fan of the book of Daniel, he actually has the general resurrection take place. Jesus is crucified, and in chapter 27, the tombs are also opened, and many bodies of the saints who have fallen asleep arise and come out of the tombs. And after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. So Daniel actually has the resurrection, the general resurrection, take place, at least for the saints, at the time that Jesus is crucified. Of course, it's a little different here. He only has the saints resurrected, where in Daniel, everyone is resurrected. So that's a little differently.
Are we talking about necromancy right here?
Well, we're talking about general resurrection. So, and this is very awkward. As Jesus is crucified, the tombs of the saints pop up, and then they don't resurrect until after Jesus is resurrected. Why? Because you see, theologically, Jesus is the first fruit of the resurrection, right? So Jesus is crucified on a Friday, their tombs popped up, they stay there until Sunday when he's resurrected, and then they're resurrected and walk into the city. It's very, very interesting. It seems like it's an interpolation. They say, oh, well, Jesus has to be resurrected first. So we'll make them wait 3 days before they're actually resurrected.
Well, is there anything to corroborate an account that people's tombs are popping out the ground and then people who are dead that are walking the earth outside the Bible?
No, this is only found in the Gospel of Matthew. None of the other Gospels have this. And you can see Matthew's heavily influenced by Daniel. You can see it here.
I'm just going to take a second here, Floyd, just to let people know that we're getting closer to the end of Floyd's presentation here. For anybody that has questions that's not watching this through the YouTube stream, the live chat is going there. So if you have any questions, you could ask them there. If this is something that you want to jump into and maybe ask Floyd some questions in the Hangout, just message Deep in the Dogma or Sock account, and I will send you a link to the Hangout as well. Sorry, go on, Floyd.
Okay. Yeah, just about finishing up here. I'm on slide 36, around 42, so I'm getting near the end. In Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 15, it actually says, Jesus was the first fruits of the resurrection. So Jesus has to be resurrected first before anyone else is. At the end here of chapter 12, Daniel asks again, when is this persecution going to end? And Gabriel tells him 1,290 days are given. So that's 3.5 years, or the last half of that last week of 70 is given. And notice here, Daniel doesn't mention any resurrection of the Messiah, or that the Messiah would return to judge. You would think in that prophecy, if the Messiah is, and it refers to Jesus, if the Messiah is going to die, why doesn't it say, and 3 days later he's resurrected? You don't get that. You have a later resurrection of everyone, but you think if this actually refers to Jesus, well, at least it would have been nice if he actually said, and the Messiah would be raised from the dead after 3 days, but we don't get any of that here. All right, Why do I think it's about Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century? Well, because all those things that are taking place as being described in those chapters mentioned what he actually did. He was a Greek king of the Seleucid Empire from 175 to his death in 164. Epiphanes means God manifest. People called him Epimanes, which means the madman, because of all the evil that this guy did. I'm going to give examples of what he actually did. Daniel 11 describes his campaigns against Egypt, and he Hellenized Jerusalem, which led to the Maccabean revolt. Hellenize, what does that mean? Hellenize is to adopt Greek culture. You might come across that term before. To Hellenize is to adopt Greek culture, to assimilate to Greek way of thinking, to their culture, and so forth. The Hellenized Jews, under his control, built a gymnasium within Jerusalem and encouraged Greek culture. So they actually built a Greek gymnasium within Jerusalem during this time. At 168 BCE, he stopped a resistance where the city was destroyed. Many Jews were killed, and a military citadel was built called the Acra that was built on the southeast corner of Jerusalem. He defiled the temple. He offered a pig on his altar. That's one of the desecrations that took place. He erected an altar to Zeus. He prohibited temple worship. He forbid circumcision. He sold thousands of Jews into slavery. He destroyed copies of Scripture. He prohibited Jewish worship and customs such as Sabbath observances. So he just wanted to put an end to Judaism altogether. And he just wanted to Hellenize them. Here's a direct quote from First Maccabees that talks about what he did. It says, deceitful, he spoke peaceable words to them, and they believed him. But he suddenly fell upon the city, dealt a severe blow, and destroyed many people of Israel. He plundered the city, burned it with fire, tore down its houses, and destroyed its surrounding walls. And then took captive the women and children and seized the cattle. They then fortified the city of David with a great strong wall and strong towers, and it became their citadel. And they stationed there a sinful people, lawless men. These strengthened their position. They stored up arms and food, and collecting the spoils of Jerusalem, and they stored them there and became a great snare. It became an ambush against the sanctuary, an evil adversary of Israel continually. On every side of the sanctuary, they shed innocent blood. Then they even defiled the sanctuary. And note what Daniel 11:31 says. It says, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and they shall take away continual burnt offerings, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. What is the abomination that makes desolate? That's that Zeus altar to Zeus that they built. Why do I think it's High Priest Onias III? He was the son of Simon II, high priest during the Second Temple period of Judaism. He was described in scriptures as a pious man who opposed the Hellenization of Judea. He was succeeded by his brother Jason in 175 BCE when Antiochus came into power. 2 Maccabees 3:1 praises his piety against hatred of his piety and his hatred of wickedness. He was removed from his position through political fighting and was succeeded by his brother Jason. He was a Hellenizer. He was killed in 171 BCE when he exposed the high priest Eminlaus, I butchered that name, for stealing and selling some of the gold vessels of the temple. So he was actually killed. And Daniel 8, Daniel 9, and Daniel 11 generally refer to the murder of Onias. If you want me to play the math game here with Onias, well, I can do it here. I take the 605 BCE, I minus the 434 solar years. I'm not doing the funky prophetic years or the lunar years. It takes you to 171 BCE. Am I leaning on, relying on this calculation? Not at all. I don't think doing these calculations are that important. I go by this because this is the high priest who was killed during the persecution of Antiochus. Here's a chart that was given by George Athos. He's from the Moore Theological College in Sydney, Australia. He starts at the 605 and goes to 171. Those are the 62 weeks. He puts the 7 weeks within it. He even, during the last week, that's when Antiochus desecrates the temple and stops Jewish sacrifices. And in 164, that's when Antiochus dies, and that's when the Maccabees rededicate the temple. So this is a general critical scholarly view of those 70 weeks of years. I'll go through. I'm finishing up now. One more slide after this. I'm going to reinterpret the whole prophecy again. 70 weeks of years are decreed. Again, that's 490 years. In verse 25, know, therefore, understand, from the time that the word went out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the time of the anointed prince, there will be 7 weeks. Again, that could be Cyrus, probably Joshua, the high priest at the time. For 62 weeks, it was, Jerusalem was rebuilt. That's 434 years. After those 434 years, the anointed one's cut off. He's killed. Again, high priest Onias III. The troops of the prince, that's Antiochus, he comes in, destroys the city and sanctuary, and he comes in with a flood of his army. And the desolations are decreed. What desolations? Well, he sacrificed a pig on the altar. That's certainly a desolation. He made covenant, a strong covenant with the many. That's covenant with the Hellenized Jews at the time. He puts an end to all Judaism, basically. Sacrifices and offerings cease. He puts up the abomination desolates. That's the Zeus altar. That's the statue of Zeus. And then after that, he is killed. So again, here's a comparison comparing what conservative evangelicals interpret it to the common critical secular view. This is not the view. This is just a common view. There are many views. But when will the word to restore Jerusalem comes out? Well, it varies. It varies. I offered 6. Normally they'll pick the 457 or the 444. Who's the anointed prince in verse 25? Well, conservatives think it's Jesus. The scholars believe it's these candidates here. It was at the time when Cyrus let the people return. Who's the anointed one getting cut off? Well, conservatives believe it's Jesus. The critical scholars believe it's Onias III. Who's the prince that destroys the city? Well, Christians move it up to 70 CE. That is when it was destroyed in the first Roman and Jewish war. So who was the person at the time? It was Titus. So they thought Titus was the prince who destroyed the city. Or they'll take it and move it to some future time event, and they'll think some future Antichrist will be that prince. Critical scholars believe it's Antiochus Epiphanes, which I gave. What's the abomination that desolates? They normally interpret that as the destruction of the temple. That's in 70 CE, or at some later event, or some later time in history. The critical scholars believe it was the pagan altar to Zeus. And what's this last week? When will this last week take place? Some Christians interpret it as when it finished when Stephen, he was the first Christian martyr, when he was stoned in the book of Acts. They see that kind of at the end of 7 weeks. But many Christians will move it to some future event. So they'll say, oh, well, since the resurrection of the dead didn't take place, well, then that last week obviously didn't happen. So, and it must be right because the Bible's infallible. I'm going to move that to some future time when that last week happens, where critical scholars simply just take the 490 periods and say, well, hey, it simply didn't happen. The resurrection of the dead didn't happen, and the end of the present age didn't happen. So again, this to finish up here, there are many different interpretations of Daniel. There's a lot of crazy imagery, especially in chapter 7 and 8. You have four huge beasts coming out of the city. You have a twin horn ram. You have a he-goat with a horn between his eyes and so forth. You have events and dates, and they're interpreted in all sorts of different ways. Hal Lindsey, in his book, The Late Great Planet Earth, he states that the 10 horns of Daniel 7:24 represents the 10-nation European economic community. So he takes it and says, oh well, that's happening now. That's
this goes back to the very first thing where we talk about whether or not we find certain prophecies convincing or not, and I say as long as it's not the Nostradamus, it's like, oh, two lions attack the tower, therefore World War II or something like that.
Right.
This is where you're starting to get into that now.
Yeah, exactly. They'll say, oh, well, who's the 4 beasts coming out of the sea and so forth. Actually, if you read chapter 8, it actually tells you what some of these things are specifically. It'll actually mention, well, the 4 beasts are this, but then it gets more and more vague as we get towards 164. It gets more and more vague. Norman Porteous, his book Daniel Commentary, he calls his interpretations the deplorable history of the interpretation of this book, referring to people like Hal Lindsey. So that's the end of my presentation. A lot of material there. I think we almost went 2 hours, an hour and 50 minutes, so I apologize for the length of it. But you can see I could actually go longer, but I didn't really go into detail about chapter 7 and 8. I think I gave enough.
I'm looking forward to any questions in the comments, and while the video feed catches up to where they actually are there, and I'm hoping people will ask some questions. I kind of grabbed a few as we were going along here. Questions, comments along that line. One of them was from Kenneth Amiss again earlier on, that put out that the people who posed as Messiah in the Jesus claim knew about the Book of Daniel. So the prophecy is fulfilled through conscious, social, and rest. This is something that a charge is put on a lot of Christians when they talk about prophecy, especially ones from the Old Testament, is the shaping of prophecy or things that are interpreted as prophecy in the New Testament to say like, hey, see, it was fulfilled.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the common challenges to that is that if you know this, if I go into a restaurant and I order a steak, the waiter coming and bringing me my steak didn't fulfill a prophecy. When you know about all the details, you can shape the details for that.
Right. Yeah, and I go into detail about how Christians interpret the Old Testament's prophecy. I think it was episode 8. We had a discussion on biblical prophecy. I go into detail about how Christians interpret the Old Testament. They found new esoteric meaning in the Old Testament scriptures, and they're reading it with gospel-colored glasses. And I showed in this presentation Matthew, the author of the Gospel of Matthew, directly refers to the book of Daniel and uses the language, uses the terminology of Daniel in his apocalyptic verses. So so the reverse engineering. They say, okay, well, they believe the Old Testament is about Jesus, so when we read these things, we're gonna interpret these things with gospel-colored glasses.
Mm-hmm. One of the other questions that came up, or again, actually, this one is more of a comment as well, was
we went off air.
No, it's this is done through XSplit, so it never shows on air within the room. We just use the Google Hangout as the format. I could use.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, not a problem. We'll edit that out. still smiling skeptic wrote that I guess that he was always told by his minister, he was a former Presbyterian, that 7 was rarely a literal 7. It was an idiom that was used more like a bunch or lots. When they
Right.
refer to a lot of things in the Bible as well.
Yeah, it's completion of a week, right? It's a full week, so it represents a completion of a period. Yeah, so I mentioned that before. Do we actually need to interpret this literally to a strict? It must be 490 years. Do we really need to interpret that? Literally? I don't necessarily think so. And notice what interpreters do. Do they take? Some of them take. Okay, this is a starting date, and it has to equal out to 490 years sequentially. So it's a starting date to 490. So you're just going to add 490, and that's going to be the very end. But some Christians will say, "Whoa, wait a minute. Well, the resurrection of the dead didn't take place, so let's break it up. Let's move that last week to some time in the distant future." So now you're breaking up the 490 into different parts. Well, you can, or why not take that first 70 weeks and stick it in within the 62 weeks? That's what some people do as well. So you're juggling. Okay, why don't I space out those 3 periods to all different times? And I could put the 49 years within the 434, or I could just add them together. So again, pick your combination. Pick your combination.
There was a comment earlier on, I think it was around slide 36, where he said that because Jesus was raised on the Friday, that we had to wait 3 days just to allow anybody else to raise, because Jesus needed to be the first. And Michael Ishu pointed out in the comments that Jesus raised 3 people from death prior to his own crucifixion there, so he wouldn't have been the first one in that sense that you were kind of talking about there.
Yeah, I mean, the way you get around that is you say, well, Elijah resurrected people, right? Well, perhaps they died later, so that wasn't, that wasn't considered a permanent resurrection, so to speak. But what happened with those other people he raised? Well, we don't know, right? We don't know, but yeah, theologically speaking, Jesus is supposed to be the first fruits of the resurrection. And then soon after that, there's a general resurrection. Now, in the Pauline epistles, Paul only has the Christians resurrected. Paul does not have the good, the Christians and the non-Christian, everyone resurrection. Paul actually only has the Christians resurrected, and the rest of us, we just stay dead. But in other parts of the New Testament, everyone is resurrected and and judged. Some the Christians go to heaven or to a new earth, and everyone else gets banished to hell. But it's pretty consistent. I'd say it's consistent through the New Testament that the resurrection of the dead would come very soon. And if you read the book of Revelation, which is a classic example of an apocalyptic writing, it says Jesus is going to come quickly. He's going to return soon. So that they thought, the New Testament writers thought Jesus was going to return within their generation very soon. And Jesus was the beginning. Saying, well, Jesus was resurrected. He is the first fruit of the resurrection. Everyone, the general resurrection will soon come, soon. He's the first fruit, he's the first sign, he's the first apple that fell from the tree, so to speak, so all the rest of the apples will follow. And of course, it didn't happen, and that's one of the reasons why I reject Christianity, because of the failed prophecy of Jesus' return in that generation. So that's just one reason why I'm no longer a Christian.
One of the another question here from the live chat, just to do with the dating methods that we're kind of talking about here in Daniel, was that are you aware of any other scriptures written in praise of other Messiah candidates that use the same type of fuzzy math that you see in the book of Daniel?
Well, I gave two Jewish interpretations. One Alexander Jannaeus and the other one was King Herod Agrippa II. He was the son of the first Herod Agrippa. Those are two Jewish interpretations, so those are the ones I'm familiar with. Perhaps you can find others, but again, a lot of people will interpret the destruction of Jerusalem and the abomination that desolates. They'll interpret that as 70 CE. That's when the Roman army comes in and totally destroys Jerusalem. Actually, it wasn't totally destroyed. The Western Wall, which actually stands today, survived, as well as 2 or 3 northern towers. They actually survived 70 CE, and I believe they were actually destroyed in the Bar Kokhba revolt around 135. So Jerusalem was destroyed again in 135 CE. But I gave the verses in First Maccabees of what happened in 168 BCE. Antiochus Epiphanes comes in. He burns houses. He tears down the walls. Can we consider that destroyed? I would consider that destroyed. The Hebrew word for destroyed there can also mean corrupt, spoil, ruin. So it doesn't necessarily have to mean utter destruction. But of what happened during 168 BCE, I would consider that destruction of everything he did, all the killings, ripping down the walls, burning the houses, and so forth. I think that can easily be seen as the destruction of Jerusalem during that time.
All right, and this is probably going to be the last question from the chat here. Do you know any of other Messiah candidates that have any followers today? Or I'll even expand on that historically, especially in the early 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries. Were any of these other possible Messiah candidates known to have good large followings as well?
Well, if you ask if there are any Messiah candidates that who have followers that exist today, I would point to John the Baptist. There's a group called the Mandeans. They believe John the Baptist is the Messiah, and that group actually survives today. So the Mandeans, so John the Baptist would be a candidate. Other Messiah candidates, well, there's Judas the Galilean. He was killed in 6 CE during the revolt against taxes when Quirinius took over the kingdom of Judea after they got rid of Herod's son. And there's Simon Bar Kokhba, 135. He actually fought against Rome. Rabbi Akiva declared him the Messiah, but then Rome came in and killed him. He was considered a Messiah at the time, 135 CE. So those are other Messiah claimants.
All right. So Floyd, I want to thank you again for your presentation. This was actually really insightful. I'm glad that we have this, and I'm glad that it's a good resource for, like I said before, any non-believer that's talked to Christians about things like biblical prophecies, specifically in the book of Daniel. That it's good kind of a reference here to see where they're coming from, as well as, again, any theists out there, any Christian out there that does subscribe to this idea of like all these fulfilled prophecies from the book of Daniel, that it's a little bit more of an kind of diving into this to see exactly how these prophecies are fulfilled by the Apologist standard, and addresses some of the criticisms that non-believers do have with these books. So I just want to thank you for that. If anybody else on the panel has any kind of closing remarks or last questions for Floyd, I'd love to hear them now.
Well, no, I don't really have any questions. I asked most of mine during the during the presentation, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I probably will want to go back over this and look at it again in my free time, because I don't find a lot of the biblical stuff very interesting, but trying to compare it against what we can and cannot verify, I think I will find a bit of an interest in that.
All right, Simon or Helena?
Yeah, I'd like to thank Floyd very much for the presentation. Very much like Drake said, there's a lot in there which is kind of new to me, but I found it fascinating. And I think the extra biblical sources maybe that you're relating to, could you sort of name some of those? Maybe you did in the presentation. I'm sure you did, in fact, but could you just go over some of those, or where they come from and what reliability maybe they have?
Yeah, I quoted a lot from the Book of Maccabees. That was goes into detailed history about that second century. That's not in the Protestant canon, but it's in the Apocrypha and also other non-Protestant canons. You can actually go to other historians at the time, like Josephus, for example. That would be another good resource about what's taking place around that period.
Cool, thank you.
So the people that maintained that that this was really written by just one person, what do they make of just how 1 through 6 is different from 7 through 12 in the actual language it's written in? Forget beyond 12, right? What is the explanation?
Well,
to say nothing of the different style.
Yeah. I mean, it is a problem, but to say, hey, it talks about Daniel during that time, and 7 through 12 talks about the visions of Daniel. Says I Daniel, so okay, well, it's all Daniel, but yeah, I mean, it obviously looks like it was pieced together. They took these old folk tales, which seems older, and then combined that with these later visions and made the whole entire book. And by doing that, by using these old tales, it helps justify and seem that yes, this book comes from a earlier period, comes from a earlier date. Yeah. So therefore, it becomes more convincing that it's prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
So before we go off air here, what I'd like is that once this is over, obviously live chat will be gone and people can comment on the video. I'm really hoping that we get some Christians to comment any objections that they might have to Floyd's presentation or whatever. Just write something up there, and I mean, if it's good enough, if it's something that we feel should be addressed or that Floyd would like to address, we might do a quick part 2 kind of a follow-up of any criticisms that people might have, if that's okay with you, Floyd.
Oh yeah, sure. I welcome any and all comments and criticisms. Great.
So if you have any comments, if you have any criticisms, feel free to leave them in the comments, to tag myself and Floyd, and I would love to see more of a discussion on this topic of biblical prophecies. But that being said, Floyd, great presentation. Do you have any last words that you want to throw out before we go off air?
No. Thank you for giving me a resource to present this information. And again, if anyone else wants to talk to me about this, you can come find me. I'm on Hangouts almost every day, so. You should be able to find me, and again, I welcome any comments and criticisms. And everyone knows I love talking about this topic and the Bible in general and so forth. So again, thanks for letting me go on for 2 hours about this.
No problem. So again, everybody, thank you very much for tuning in, and this will probably be our new time slot, just because of, as people know, I'm on the West Coast now. My work hours have changed slightly, and unfortunately Fridays are quite busy evenings for me. So
Yay!
So now Drake can attend Deeper Than Dogma, which he wasn't able to do before, as well as a few other people. And I hope that the new time slot still does work for people. And on that, thank you very much, and everybody have yourself a good evening.